Welcome to the current webinar, the North Central Region Water Network's Speed Networking webinar series. For those of you who are not familiar with the North Central Region Water Network, we are a 12-state extension-led network working to advance water resource management and water stewardship across the North Central region and beyond. We are now in close to our 10th year of the current webinar series. Each month, we feature a different water-related topic and feature 3 presenters who are doing exciting water work in those fields. So today we're going to be talking about creating resilient shorelines, and I am excited to have 3 great presenters with us today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items for you about today's webinar. We will have a Q&A session after all 3 of our presenters speak. So please submit your questions for our presenters in the Q&A panel. You can find the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. It's the Q&A button. You can also look at other folks' questions on there and upvote questions that you also have. So if someone else asked a particularly pertinent question, make sure to upvote that. And we will get those questions that are the most popular first. We also have a chat feature in the webinar, so feel free to put any links that you have in there. We'll share links to our presenters' articles or websites there, but you can also introduce yourself or share any technical issues you may have via the chat feature. We do try to put your questions for the presenters in the Q&A panel instead of the chat, so we ensure we see them during the panel, the Q&A portion of the presentation. If you are having any issues with audio, there is a phone-in option that can be accessed by clicking up on the arrow, clicking the up arrow on the mute icon, and then switch to phone audio. Today's session is recorded and will be posted to our website, northcentralwater.org. We will also be posting the presentation slides for today's webinar as well. All right, so let's jump into things. We have 3 great presenters today. We're going to be focused on creating resilient shorelines. We have Scott Hardy with the Ohio State University and Ohio Sea Grant. And we have Adam Beckley with Wisconsin Sea Grant. And then Eric Calabro, who's going to be talking about, who's with Michigan Eagle, the Department of Environmental, Great Lakes, and Energy. So first off, we have Scott. Scott has a background working for Ohio Sea Grant program, and he's based in Cleveland. He's going to be sharing some of the research he has done on coastal vulnerability, specifically in Ohio, and how that has impacts on our shorelines. So with that, I will stop sharing and hand it right off directly to Scott.
All right. Okay, folks. Thanks a lot for tuning in today. I'm going to spend about 10, 12 minutes here talking about assessing coastal resilience and how we go about doing that in Northeast Ohio. This is a map of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District's area where you know they take care of. And the reason I'm showing this is because I feel like this type of study, this type of research is very salient in Northeast Ohio. Certainly severe storms have been the biggest form of natural hazards that we've experienced in the region, costing tons of money and having quite a big impact, especially on vulnerable communities. We know that these 1% biggest storms are becoming more frequent in the region. We also know that they're becoming more intense. So not only are we seeing more of these 100-year storms, but we're actually seeing more rainfall per storm. And this creates all sorts of problems with flooding, erosion, riverine erosion, and coastal erosion, combined sewer overflows. And we're seeing impacts on what we refer to as assets, things like businesses, utilities, transportation routes. So more rain, more problems in that regard. And unfortunately, that's the rainfall is not distributed equally. We are seeing more extreme precipitation events during certain times of the year. So in order to sort of assimilate all this data and prepare for some of the impacts that extreme precipitation can have on water quality, again, through carrying off different pollutants during flash floods, or also creating combined store overflows, and also water quality issues. So these are, gosh, we deal with all sorts of harmful algal blooms here in northern Ohio. We know that more precipitation means more runoff, and unfortunately excess nutrients that could cause some of these algal blooms. So trying to understand what populations are most vulnerable to extreme precipitation events, and what we could do to try to support those communities, I think, is a really important bit of research. So, the project I'm going to talk about today was funded by the NOAA Coastal Storms Program. The goal is to identify communities in the region that are most vulnerable to storm hazards, analyze resilience, and hopefully be able to rank all the communities in the map I showed you earlier from most to least vulnerable. This would then provide basically agencies, practitioners, policy decision makers with a roadmap of how to support the areas that are most vulnerable. Real quick, just so we're all on the same page, vulnerability, I look at as potential for loss due to hazards. Again, this loss could be property, natural resources, economic, etc. Part of this study focuses on sort of traditional environmental hazards like severe storms. Also, we focus a bit on social vulnerability. So these are sort of the social, economic, and demographic factors which help identify communities that might be less capable to respond to some of these climatic changes. And much of this research is based on the work of Susan Cutter at the University of South Carolina. She came up with the hazards of place model way back in '96, which I think is brilliant, because it really was the first time that we were able to combine sort of the social vulnerability and biophysical vulnerability to just determine sort of an overall hazards profile, or overall hazard vulnerability index, if you will, for a specific area. This here just shows Cutter's social vulnerability index. There are a lot of variables, and I'm on a very short timeline, so I'm not going to get too much into this today. I will say that various not only researchers like myself, but agencies as well, have really adopted Cutter's approach to try to use it as a roadmap for funneling resources to the most needed areas. And if you go on their website, if you just Google, for instance, social vulnerability index, you can really get down to the census tract across the whole United States. So this data is out there. It's all based on Census Bureau data. It's really robust data set, and I think it could be very helpful, especially when combined with, whether it be climate models or simply resource management data from a specific site. And that's kind of what we did today. So real quick, here's a real sort of a sketch, if you will, of what this hazards of place model looks like. Again, you're really trying to combine the sort of risk factors and offset those with mitigation factors, and how they impact different populations of people in different geographic locations due to the sort of biophysical setting which they're located, as well as the social vulnerability of groups who live in that area. And then you can come up with a vulnerability of place. This is what my sort of index looked like. I combined 10 measures, 5 social and 5 environmental, to create these 2 sort of social and environmental vulnerability indicators. And I combined all that to form a hazards index, which allows us to rank from most to least vulnerable every community located in the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District area. So if we start with the social vulnerability indicator, this is all based on U.S. Census data. Again, these are data points suggested by Cutter and her team, who's done a lot of work in this space. As you can see, various groups within the population are seen as more vulnerable than others. So people who are over 64 and under 18, simply due to mobility issues. Gender, women seen as more vulnerable than men. People who have live below the poverty line are seen as more vulnerable, again, just because they have less resources to support resilience efforts. People who are non-Caucasian are seen as more vulnerable. People who are transient, that means they rent their houses, are seen as having less resources and less sort of social capital within their community networks, so they're also seen as more vulnerable. What we did is we calculated this for every community, as you can see here in the map of the sewer district area. We are then able to show with the darker colors the more vulnerable areas. We can see right downtown Cleveland, East Cleveland, and the sort of eastern inner ring suburbs are the most socially vulnerable. We then wanted to look at environmental vulnerability, and this map looks quite a bit different. Instead of using the census data, we base this on percentage of land within each community that falls within the 100-year flood zone. We also use data from the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District's Stormwater Inventory and Inspection Project. They had people walk every stream and creek and river mile in the whole district with handheld GPS units, and were able to identify areas of extreme erosion, water quality issues where there were pollutants dumping into the river, structural hazards, bridges, etc., that might be contributing to water quality issues, and debris hazards. We then mapped this out. As you can see, it looks quite different from the social vulnerability map. As a matter of fact, many of these kind of most socially vulnerable communities aren't very environmentally vulnerable at all. However, this region down the center, and even this over here, seems to be a bit more vulnerable. If you're not from Cleveland, that happens to coincide with the Cuyahoga River Valley. So that first variable there, acres in a 100-year flood zone, proved to be one of the most impactful of all the variables across the two indicators. Of course, what we did then is once we had scores for both, we combined them. Communities that had high social and environmental vulnerability scores were combined, and they scored much higher on this vulnerability index. And communities that had low social or environmental vulnerability scored much lower. When we put the maps together, this is what it looked like. As you can see that the results skew slightly closer to the environmental vulnerability indicator rather than the social. And really, this data was used to help inform resilience planning in Northeast Ohio. The idea was to identify the most at-risk populations. My hope was that the results would be used for planning and zoning, developing model codes and ordinances for prioritizing best management practices, where they should take place, etc. Also conservation measures and a lot of green infrastructure. I've worked quite a bit with green infrastructure in the region, especially in the kind of coastal zone there, trying to identify opportunities to both reduce problems with water quantity, so things like flooding, but also remove toxins or excess nutrients, etc., to help improve water quality. We've also done a ton of education and outreach, so webinars, workshops, etc. Certainly presented this to some folks at the sewer district as well. It also has formed the backdrop for some applied research. I published an article in 2017 in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction called "Here Comes the Rain," which I encourage you to check out if this kind of stuff interests you. I will say that overall it's been a really positive project. And I want to definitely, acknowledge the folks who helped do this. So the NOAA Coastal Storms Program funded. The sewer district was invaluable, not only with their data on their stormwater inventory project, but also helping with the GIS mapping. Some friends at ODNR helped identify percentage of each community in the 100-year flood zone, and the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessment Lab are the ones who created the climate projections. So a huge shout out to everybody. Again, it's been a really positive project in terms of trying to create sort of some guidance, if you will, on how and where to prioritize resilience planning in the region. I find it a fascinating question, what role exists for government and these sort of collaborative environmental management institutions, and the idea that there's really a scarce amount of resources, whether that's financial or technical, or even just time resources to support resilience planning, whether that be in a regional scale or more on the municipality scale. I think this type of project and this type of research could help prioritize where those stark resources could be used and where they should be prioritized, and sort of identify the communities and the hotspots to really focus on moving forward. So I think that's about all the time I have. I'm going to hop off now, but I look forward to answering questions at the end.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. I appreciate it. And so that's an interesting transition to our next speaker. You know, looking at that map there, we definitely see there are quite a few areas on the Great Lakes, on the Lake Erie coastline that Scott identified as high risk. So next we're going to be hearing from Adam Beckley with Wisconsin Sea Grant. You can read his full bio there. But Adam's going to be talking about nature-based shoreline options for Great Lake shores in terms of stabilizing the coast. So what are some of those options if we're going to prioritize resources to those highly vulnerable areas? What are some of the BMP options for the Great Lake shores? So Adam, I will stop sharing and hand it off to you.
Thanks, Anne Marie. I put a link to the guide that I'll be talking about in the chat. I'll share a couple other links after I'm done talking. But yeah, we developed a guide called Nature-Based Shoreline Options for Great Lakes Coasts. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Brianna Shea and Jean Clark, putting this guide together. This guide was put together on a NOAA-funded project in collaboration with the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program, Southeast Regional Planning Commission, and the University of Wisconsin College of Engineering. And so really the genesis for this guide was started at the idea in 2017 as water levels on the Great Lakes were rising towards record highs, and people we were talking to really wanted to know kind of what their options were that weren't gray options, revetments, seawalls, something greener. And we could show them guidance from the oceans, from inland lakes, but we didn't really have anything specific to the Great Lakes. And so that brought the idea together that we really ought to sort of define what are some categories of nature-based shorelines that work in the Great Lakes with some examples. And so that's what I'll be going over today. So for the purposes of this guide, we took the definition of nature-based shorelines to be those that use or mimic natural features to stabilize the coast. So dealing with things like erosion and flooding. So why would you want to take this sort of approach? Well, some of the benefits of nature-based shorelines, you can just kind of see them from these two pictures here. We have an old failing seawall on the left and a nature-based shoreline on the right. So what you get by pursuing a nature-based shoreline, possibility for habitat creation or habitat improvement, possibility for water quality improvements when you're introducing things like plants that can filter out the water, slow down runoff. You can use hybrid approaches, a gray-green combination. Aesthetic enhancements, of course, it's in the eye of the beholder, but I think a lot of people might prefer the picture on the right. Public access to the water might be easier with a nature-based shoreline. And then in some cases, costs may be lower. Not every case, but it can be a situation where you realize cost savings. So why don't we see them everywhere? Well, there are challenges and some specific to the Great Lakes. As I mentioned, in ocean environments or inland lake environments, you can more readily find some areas of lower wave energy where you can take a nature-based approach. A lot of our Great Lakes shorelines are exposed coasts to high wave energy. We are cold climate where we have ice that can impact these shorelines. And then our water level fluctuations certainly add some challenges. But there are techniques where you start to address some of these challenges. Again, a cold environment, we have a shorter growing season to get some of our nature-based features like vegetation established. There are different maintenance needs for nature-based shorelines compared to gray infrastructure. Maybe annual maintenance, weeding out invasive species and things like that compared to the maintenance you need for gray infrastructure, which is needed. It just may be a bit more episodic. Maybe after a big storm, your revetment gets blown out and you need to do some maintenance there. So you still have to maintain gray infrastructure. It just looks different from nature-based infrastructure. And of course, these are emerging practices in the Great Lakes. And so finding folks to do the work, permitting, those can be challenges, but they are, more people are doing these projects. So those are becoming less as time goes on. So as I mentioned, we essentially took a look and tried to define 6 broad categories of nature-based shorelines in the Great Lakes. And so I'll show some examples of them. They're not the only options that work. They give an idea of what sort of broad categories there are. And so we defined each of these categories, and then for each of them, we tried to give a definition for relative ranking for things like environmental benefits, wave energy that these options work in, the type of coastal slope that they work on, from sort of more shallow, low sloped, more stable environments to our higher, less stable environments, relative cost, and then maintenance requirements. And these are all relative rankings. They don't have absolute values associated with them, but they're meant to help distinguish these different options from each other. So our first category was vegetation, which we defined as native vegetation planted on the shore. The roots can reinforce sediments, dissipate wave energy, and slow things like runoff and wind that can also cause erosion. You see from the diagram, this can be predicated on where you're looking to put your nature-based shoreline up in the upland dune vegetation or vegetation that is adaptable to different water level regimes. As I mentioned, we have case studies for each of these types. For this is Bradford Beach in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This was a beach that had water quality issues with stormwater outletting onto the beach. So they built bioswales. So in the depression is water-loving vegetation, and then on the banks of that bioswale is dune grass, which helps stabilize that bank, as well as keep any sand out from blowing off of the beach and into the vegetated bioswale. Our next option was nourishment, which is the placement of clean sediment, often sand, sometimes cobbles on beaches, dunes, or in nearshore waters to replace sand that's lost or to build dunes. And so one thing that's notable about nourishment is oftentimes where you place the sand is not where it's going to end up. Nature is going to move it around. We're working with nature here. So it will either be kind of moved into a new profile shown in the dashed line here by waves, possibly moved along the shore, maybe as a sacrificial element where you have to re-nourish it at different intervals. That's part of working with nature. Our example is Blue Harbor Resort in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. This brand new conference center, when it was built, needed shoreline protection to protect that investment. You'll see here on the right, there's a revetment, and that sort of disappears into sand. That was actually nourished sand that was brought in to create essentially an artificial dune, provide access to the shoreline, habitat. This was at a low water period. In our recent high water period, a lot of that sand was inundated. Some of it was pulled off, exposing the underlying revetment. But that's the point of working with that hybrid solution is you have the nature-based element and the gray element working together to provide that backstop. And now that water levels have gone down a bit on the Great Lakes, we see some of that sand is reaccreting and starting to build back the dune more naturally. Our next option, slope stabilization. This is regrading or reinforcing an eroding bluff, bank, or dune to establish a stable slope, which will help allow vegetation establish. Vegetation is really hard to establish on our eroding slopes. So this is sort of helping make an environment where we can get vegetation to establish. Our case study here is the former University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Chancellor's residence in Shorewood, Wisconsin. You can see here reasonably stable shoreline. There's a revetment there, but erosion taking place within 8 feet of that house. This is what it looked like, again, getting very close to the house. Instead of going with something like a wood or concrete retaining wall, what was selected was a living wall. This is basically geotextile material that's planted. So this is the construction process, picking up those sacks of geotextile material to build that wall. This is the finished product, beautiful, provides great habitat for pollinators and birds. Great example of a nature-based shoreline. Next category is edging. This is starting to deal with some wave energy. This is the placement of some material, either a core log, wood, or stones at the toe or base of a shoreline. This will help prevent erosion and give that vegetation some time to establish so it doesn't get washed out by wave energy. Our case study here, Shoreline Park in Sandusky, Ohio. This is a relatively sheltered embayment, but you can still see before the project, there was evidence of erosion on the shoreline. So they use core logs and vegetation to build up a nature-based shoreline to reestablish a natural shoreline and really stabilize this park and provide a beautiful solution compared to, say, a stone revetment, which was also an alternative to consider. Next option is a sill. This is a low profile structure that's located in the water just off the shoreline. It's not high like a harbor breakwater. It's really kind of right at the high water line where the top of that sill is. And it's used to dissipate wave energy and create an area of protected natural marsh. So you get some vegetation to establish behind it. Starting to take a little bit more wave energy. Our case study here is the Marysville Living Shoreline in Marysville, Michigan. This is on the banks of the St. Mary's River. So not the open coast of the Great Lakes, but they get a lot of wave energy from shipping. This is where those big freighters pass through from Lake Huron to Lake Erie. So lots of ship wakes can cause a lot of wave energy on the shoreline. This is what it looks like at low water levels. We have our sill on the right, our planted marsh in the middle, and then a rock edging on the left. Low water, and this is what it looks at high water. So you can see those three elements kind of working together to provide wave protection when water levels are high. Our final category is ecologically enhanced hard armoring. This is a situation where you've got high wave energy. You need to kind of bring in a more traditional gray infrastructure solution to deal with that high wave energy, but looking at ways to add nature-based elements. So vegetation, textured surfaces, other features added to those conventional hard armoring structures to build a hybrid solution. So maybe a marsh, a joint planted revetment, some elements of nature working together. So our case study here is Sam Myers Park in Racine, Wisconsin. This site had a relic breakwater, but that created some problems with circulation. A lot of runoff was flowing into this embayment, really poor water quality. Also, it was just populated with Phragmites. So what the city of Racine did was raise that breakwater up, provide a sheltered embayment for a wetland restoration. Now the stormwater is treated, it runs through the wetland. Water quality has improved quite a bit in the bay. Lots of species have returned. So really working with that gray infrastructure to create a nature-based feature. If you want to read more about this, we have a story map, a walking tour basically. I'll put a link in the chat to look at all the different elements of this project. This is our summary slide. This is all those options with all those ratings kind of compared against each other. So you can kind of see where these sit compared to each other, try to help select which options you might consider moving forward with. I'd just like to thank everyone who was a reviewer, contributor to this guide, and thank you for your attention as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Adam. All right, great. Next up, our final speaker for today is Eric Calabro. So Eric is, it's actually a great transition because some of those images that Adam was using were from Michigan Eagle. So Eric is with Michigan Eagle and going to be, or the Department of Environment, Great Lakes Energy, Wetlands, Lakes and Streams program. He's going to be talking about a policy that's taking place in Michigan to get a lot of these BMPs, not all of the BMPs Adam's talked about because he was specifically talking about Great Lake shorelines, and Eric is working more inland lakes, but getting some of those BMPs on the ground and implemented in Michigan, and has some data to share on how that program's been going as well and its impact. So excited to hear more about it. I will stop sharing and hand it off to you, Eric.
Thanks. All right, thank you, everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about some of Michigan's recent policy changes regarding seawalls on inland lakes and touching on some of the best management practices that a lot of folks have been moving towards in terms of more homeowner scale techniques. So I'm going to start by reviewing the department's justification for making some of our more recent policy changes, and then move into some examples of BMPs that are now required with shoreline hardening projects on inland lakes in Michigan. So just to kind of lay a foundation, we all know natural shorelines provide important functions and values to both the inland lake systems and the people of Michigan. And we know that shoreline simplification results in a loss of habitat heterogeneity that can have negative impacts on fish and wildlife communities. We know that physically complex shore zones provide richer and more diverse communities, and fish and other organisms are highly associated with complex habitats with vegetation and woody structure. And what we're seeing in Michigan is we're seeing, lakes that have looked like this at some point in the past with woody structure and beautiful wetland fringe and higher quality lake sheds be transformed into lakes that look more like this through, historical development and kind of the perpetuation of, how these lakes were built out in the past. And, with these more developed lakes, we see less woody structure, less vegetation, and, obviously turf grass to the shoreline, fully seawalled shorelines. And these seawalls around our inland lakes don't really provide any ecological value, right? They actually harm the lake, scouring of the lake bottom, they cause sediment suspension, they don't support aquatic plants, really have any habitat complexity, and just a variety of different negative effects. And, if you had one seawall on otherwise undeveloped inland lake, maybe it wouldn't really be that impactful. But it's the cumulative impacts that I'm getting a warning that my internet connection is unstable. I hope you guys can still hear me. But it's the cumulative impacts of these types of developments that are really causing issues. And by cumulative impacts, the Clean Water Act defines cumulative impacts in this whole definition, but this underlying portion I thought is really good. So it says, although the impact of a particular discharge may constitute a minor change in itself, the cumulative effect of numerous such piecemeal changes can result in a major impairment of the water resources. So, and this is really what we've seen in Michigan. So there's been a variety of studies. One of them was by Dr. Worley, I guess over 10 years ago now, where he evaluated, him and his group evaluated over 300 lakes in Michigan. And they were finding that in southern Michigan, we had roughly 70% of our lakes had high development intensity. And in northern Michigan, we had 22% of those lakes in northern Michigan had high development intensity. But one of the big results from the study was that, they found that studies from Michigan and multiple other states suggested that shoreline residential development has had cumulative effects on littoral habitats that are pervasive and widespread. And, this was again shown in the Michigan National Lake Assessment data in 2012. Lake habitat complexity was keyed out as, one of the important factors Michigan had to look at is in that study, roughly 50% of the lakes assessed were categorized as most disturbed. And then a similar trend in 2017 with the Michigan National Lakes Assessment data, where it was like 30% in 2017, but it was still, we had more lakes categorized as poor for lake habitat complexity than any other category. So we've also done a number of case studies in Michigan, and we have a project ongoing right now where we're building this out even further, where we're digitizing and classifying shorelines of inland lakes using historical imagery and comparing them to throughout time. So this is an image of Silver Lake in Genesee County from 1940, I believe, where this shoreline has been digitized and classified in terms of these four categories, undeveloped upland, wetland shoreline, developed shoreline, which is basically areas that have been continually maintained by people, and then hardened shorelines. And this was again done, this image is from 2015. And when comparing this data, what we found was that in 1940, we had a combined 86% of this lake shoreline was undeveloped upland and wetland. When compared to 2015, we had 34% that was undeveloped upland and wetland. And there was this big flip, right? So here's 66% in 1940 was wetland, and now we have 60% that was hardened. This is really important, and it highlights why avoiding and minimizing environmental impacts at the individual property scale is important. This is another image from Portage Lake in Livingston County, Michigan, where you can see just wetland shoreline, natural shoreline all around this bay. And this is an image from 1938. And then here's another image just from summer before last in 2022. So again, this highlights that it's important to think cumulatively when designing projects, and it really underscores the importance of conserving small habitat fragments that we have left. again, this is just one person's lifetime this change has occurred in. This is 84 years. So I think it's really important to start thinking differently about how we've developed our landscapes and how we're moving forward. We've seen in Michigan the cumulative impacts of seawalls on our inland lakes, shoreline hardening has been significant. And we've reached a point now where the education and technology and infrastructure has made less impactful alternatives widely available and achievable. And Eagle, previously DEQ, we've been addressing this issue by making small incremental changes over the past 15 to 20 years, both regulatory changes and a variety of other methods. I'm going to be just scratching the surface on some of the more recent regulatory changes that we've made in the remainder of this talk. So in Michigan, we have a 3-tiered permitting approach. So this system is set up that the level of permitting reflects the extent of the project. So at the very lowest level here, we have our exempt activities. The next level up, we have our general permit and minor project categories. And these are lists of activities where if the applicant can design their project to meet the criteria of a category, it can be permitted at a lower cost and with no public notice. And these lists of activities are kind of our BMPs for a variety of different projects on wetlands, lakes, and streams. If a project can't be designed to meet these categories, then it is a public notice project. So everything else kind of falls in this category. And we update the criteria of our minor project categories at least every 5 years. Most often it's every 2 to 3 years or so to incorporate new technology and science and needs of the public. And our more recent changes were put into place in the end of summer of 2021. And kind of narrowing it again on our replacement of existing seawalls category. So we do have a minor project category for seawall replacements. And the big change that was made to this category in 2021 was the incorporation of a best management practice requirement to go along with all replacement walls. In Michigan, we're not really in the habit of issuing new seawalls anymore, but in the certain, kind of narrow situations where they are issued, BMPs are required for those as well. So these best management practices are applicant selected. So whoever's applying for the permit needs to propose that BMP to the department for our review. We do provide some general suggestions. And we work with each applicant individually to find a permittable BMP that works with their property and is commensurate with the size of the project. So obviously the idea behind these BMPs is to bring back some of the functions and values that were lost, with, these replacement walls and when they were initially put in. So a lot of the properties that we work with are, have, especially in southern Michigan, are on more developed lakes, and they've had seawalls for decades. These are the BMPs that we're suggesting, but we've also permitted a number that were outside of this. So a 6-foot buffer zone directly behind the seawall along the entirety of the seawall length, shoreline woody structure, and then reducing the size of that wall and installing bioengineering or a more greener method along the remainder. So this is what a 6-foot buffer zone could look like along an inland lake. This one, I don't remember. I took this picture just this last summer. I don't remember the county, but this is an example of what this could look like. So different buffer zone orientations are okay as long as they're providing a clear and direct benefit to the lake. We've seen some people plant kind of the swales in between homes and things like that. And there's a variety of different methods that people have been using to incorporate this buffer zone on their property if it's chosen. Shoreline woody structure. So we are really trying to encourage project designs that mimic natural processes. So in general, we're looking for, as far as scale, 1 single tree per 25 feet of seawall replacement. And then there's a few design characteristics here that I added. as long as they're not impeding navigation and you know, attached firmly to the shoreline and bottomland. We've seen a variety of different methods. Here's one that was staked in where they had their tree clusters. Here's one where they installed woody structure for that BMP requirement, and they actually bolted the tree to a bracket on the wall and then put a post stone over top. So there's a variety of different methods. Wall reduction is another method. So here's an example plan that somebody submitted where you see their replacement seawall here, and then they incorporated some natural planted areas as well. So, and then we also encourage bioengineering on inland lakes. So these are just two of our most common and kind of basic bioengineering designs that I've seen that can be used with either wall reductions or on their own. The idea behind the core logs and the shallow slope revetments, you know, these are used to really facilitate native plant establishment and growth. You know, these small cobble will eventually fill in with sediment and the plants will move out, as you can see in this project over time. So this is a project in a higher energy area. Down below here, you can see the seawall right next to it. So we have a lot of really good examples of bioengineering projects around Michigan on a story map, which is on our shoreline protection website. There's a lot of great projects, especially in higher energy areas, that are highlighted on that website. So I'm a firm believer that every property can do something. It may be big, it may be small, but here's an example of a really narrow property where, and this is the plans that were submitted for this property here, where they did two small native gardens along their shoreline here. They obviously have a lot of stuff going on and a really narrow yard. So that was you know, one thing that they could do to make our lakes better. So here's what was accomplished in 2022. So we had almost 300 seawall replacements in 2022 that were permitted with a BMP. I expanded the key up top here, so you can see the triangles are buffers. The diamonds here are reducing wall, and the asterisks are woody structure. And this was just our first year. So, like I said, this is data from our first year. This is really when we were transitioning into this new requirement. So where you see this no BMP required and kind of a big number of projects here, this is really a fast transitioning into the new policy. So after, as the year went on, we were seeing less and less projects that didn't have a BMP there. So the majority of our projects went with buffer zones. I'm just still working through 2023 data. Actually, I was trying to get through it today. And we were really seeing a lot more woody structure projects and some of the other BMPs as people were getting more creative with the BMP requirement. So, and here's our permitting numbers. There was a lot of nuance to these numbers, and so I'm not going to get into a lot of it, but these are permit numbers for construction-based activities on wetlands, lakes, and streams, Great Lakes, and other areas where land meets water in Michigan in 2022. What I really wanted to show here is about 1/3 of all of the permits that our program does are shoreline armoring permits on inland lakes and streams. They account for about 1/3 of everything our program issues. And implementing these BMP requirements really adds a bit more green into what is otherwise a gray project that perpetuates this hardening on this landscape. You know, there are many developed inland lake landscapes in Michigan. That's just the fact of the matter. But cumulatively, doing small good things at the property scale can make a difference when all these small BMPs add up. So I think I'm running out of time, but I have a couple slides. Please check out our shoreline protection website. There's a lot more in-depth information on BMPs and bioengineering and natural shorelines, as well as the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership. They're a huge resource in Michigan and outside of Michigan for natural shoreline work on it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. All right, so we have some time here for Q&A, and we do have some questions in the Q&A panel, so we'll go ahead and dive right into it. The first question is for, let's see, the first question is for Adam, I believe here. Haley's wondering, for the wetland project in St. Myers Park, you noted about the Phragmites. Was that project, did it help naturally eliminate the Phragmites, or was that plant still a problem?
Well, so yeah, eliminating the Phragmites was one of the first steps in the project. So before doing a lot of the wetland restoration was eradicating the Phragmites. They still do annual invasive species management. So it's always something they have to be kind of beating back. But certainly it's not everywhere as it once was. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Combination of factors leading to that. And Eric, this question is for you. Daniel's really liking the graphical representation or approach that you took of the changes over time, fading out from the photos from the 1940s and the current development. How did you do that? And Adam's there sharing the historical area photos for Minnesota, for example. Do you have similar assets in Michigan?
Yeah, that's just a little PowerPoint magic. I think you're talking about the swipe slides that I had where it was fading. Yeah, so we have access to historical imagery, so all I did was take that historical imagery and then put another recent image. I was using images from Nearmap and other sources over top of it and just fading it. So
yeah, but I think it's interesting to look at those historical images for your own state and see if they are available. I'm not sure, Daniel, if you're in Michigan or in Minnesota, where I know Andy has sent some pictures. Okay, here, let's go to some questions for you, Scott. I know you answered some of these in written, but I'm going to ask them verbally here too, because we want to make sure they're recorded and so that everyone can see them. So Catherine's curious about a specific method you use to narrow down the indicators and the measures and factors such as PCA or CCA.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I certainly wasn't the first to take this sort of theoretical approach to trying to understand vulnerability and resilience in coastal zones. So, you know, as I responded online, the reality is I just followed what other folks had already done as well. So there's quite a bit of work looking at sort of coastal vulnerability using this sort of social and environmental components, both in the Gulf of Mexico. This was following like Hurricane Katrina, as well as like the mid-Atlantic. So when Superstorm Sandy came through, there was a lot of sort of research done on this as well. So basically I just sort of adopted the same approach that others have taken in other areas and kind of brought that to the Great Lakes. And that's what guided my work.
Great, thank you. Eric, I think you were typing in an answer. Someone was curious, I'm sorry, I'm trying to keep track. Someone was curious about funding available for property owners to be able to meet these new requirements. I was also curious, my own self, about, you know, what was the public perception of the new policy as well. I don't know if these go together, if there was any kind of pushback from like owners, and if so, was there any, you know, funding available to implement some of the new policy?
yeah, so we currently don't have any sort of reimbursement program. That's one thing that I'm part of a group that we're currently working on. So we're starting to kind of plan, and hopefully we'll have a program similar to Wisconsin that, you know, offers money for inland lake BMPs like that. And to get at your question, yes, there was a lot of initial pushback, a lot of, you know, we have a lot of businesses in Michigan who revolve around seawalls, a lot of small businesses, and this was a big change and still is a big, I mean, we're 2 years into it and this still is a big change for a lot of people. But I think a lot of people also see the value in it and see, you know, I think what the department is trying to accomplish with this. But yeah, it's taken a lot of education and outreach and, you know, talking to people to, you know, be able to accomplish what we have so far, so.
Yeah, have you noticed any, you said at first, but it's still kind of a big change. Have you noticed any changes in the last 2 years in how, like, the public sentiment around the policy?
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time?
Changes in the last 2 years in terms of the changes in public sentiment around the policy.
There has been, yeah, like initially we were getting a lot of pushback from industry and things like that, but I think you know, once people have started to see some of these changes on the landscape, it has ended up being a really positive thing. And, you know, we still do honestly run into challenges with this. Our permitting is set up, so it's a negotiation with every file, but it really is a positive outcome, you know, once we reach that with a homeowner or a landowner. So
Yeah, thanks. Sorry to cohort with my questions. Certainly some of those illustrations of the beauty of some of these natural BMPs can be helpful maybe in some of that. So I'm a little curious. Kate had a question for you, Scott. Or I guess not really a question, more of a comment. Found it interesting that some of those high-risk social economical areas often correlated with high-risk environmental areas. Would you say that was true or not overall?
I'd say there were definitely some places where, you know, kind of the social vulnerability correlated with environmental vulnerability. And that's kind of what this project's targeted to do, right? Trying to identify areas that really are sort of experiencing high vulnerability, both from social and environmental factors, risk factors. And, you know, and to me, that's where if there are resources available for resilience or, you know, helping to build adaptive capacity, that sort of thing, you know, to me, that's sort of, you know, a great opportunity to sort of a roadmap to where those resources should be allocated. There were some places in our study where that didn't happen. You know, some of the most socially vulnerable areas were kind of those eastern inner ring suburbs, you know, where they didn't really have that high of environmental vulnerability. You know, it's a little bit higher land, it's out of the 100-year flood zone. Whereas, you know, if you go south of the city, there's some more affluent neighborhoods that, because they're so close to the river, when the river floods and such, you're going to be in an environmentally vulnerable situation. So yeah, there are definitely some differences, but those areas where there is overlap, I think is a great area to target for sort of increased resource allocation.
Okay, Adam, a question for you from Nigel. First off, a compliment to the Natural Shoreline Guide. He is curious why you didn't use common construction terms like terracing and live staking in a few of the descriptions you provided.
Yeah, I think I was just typing a response to Nigel, but I think that it's a good point. I think, you know, certainly if we revisit or edit the guide, it's something we can consider. I think partly it was when we're putting it together, we weren't intentionally not trying to make a how-to guide that focused on technique and terminology like that. It was more of an overview. So I think we probably didn't give as fine of a point on getting some of those terminology exactly. But I think we could definitely bolster it with some of those without too much effort. So thanks for the comment.
And this question is probably towards Eric, but I think all of you might have some insight and thoughts on it. This is from Christina. Would natural buffer zones be more efficient at reducing phosphorus levels in lakes from septic system leaks than seawalls? Were most of the cases on sewer, or were septic systems considered design factor? I'm assuming that's for you, Eric, but if anyone else has any insight they wanted to share.
So the question was, are buffer zones effective at reducing phosphorus from septics? Potentially, you know, it's not really a large area of my expertise. I think, you know, what our thought was behind the buffer zone BMP was more for, you know, sediment and runoff capturing behind the wall as well as habitat. But yeah, I'd be curious to see what the other panelists think.
Yeah, any comments from you, Scott or Adam?
I mean, I think like Eric, definitely outside of my expertise, so I hesitate to comment, but I mean, if I'm being honest, if I'm thinking about the utility of wetlands, you know, coastal wetlands to reduce phosphorus, the impact would be so much greater from ag runoff than, you know, septics that are so diffuse, you know, across a large ag landscape. There's just such, you know, low sort of, you know, low density development. I don't know. I guess when I think of, you know, the power of wetlands in those areas, it really is for larger stormwater runoff. But I would imagine that, yes, they would do a better job of capturing septic phosphorus as well. Although I'm unfamiliar with any studies that tried to deal with that specific question. Adam, are you agreeing or disagreeing with me there?
I'm agreeing that it's outside my area of expertise. There's, the concepts make sense, but I can't speak to the data.
Yeah, absolutely. Just speaking overall to wetlands being that, that absorber and that, filtering effect. So you would assume that, so Mark, Andre has a similar kind of follow-up questions. Do you guys ever take water samples before and a couple of years after the implementation of the buffer zones to see if they work to improve? He's thinking about specifically fish habitat in smaller waterways. That might not be work that any of y'all specifically do.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, so I'm one person on a much larger study funded by the Great Lakes Protection Fund. We've partnered with the Great Lakes Clean Marina Program and Sea Grant in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio. And we've installed 4 separate green infrastructure practices at coastal marinas. And we've partnered with a couple of researchers from Ohio State who have set up auto samplers. So it measures the system. So, picture like one area's got a bioretention cell, others kind of like a big, I don't know, constructed wetland. But the cool thing is these Ohio State researchers, Ryan Winston is the lead PI on that part of it. They set up auto samplers that measure a suite of water quality and quantity samples before and after it goes through the system. So yeah, we're definitely trying to do that, and we should have the first article of several coming out in the journal Oceanography here in the next few months, I'm hoping. But again, the Ohio State Watershed Management Team, I think is what they call themselves, are doing this type of work, and they've published some stuff doing similar projects in the past on the Chagrin River watershed and other areas. So yeah, people are thinking about it, that's for sure.
Great.
And I guess one example from my presentation, the Sam Myers restoration, that went from a area with a swim ban, so they were monitoring water quality, swim ban, to reopening as a boating beach. So they don't want a bathing beach to walk all over the vegetation, but water quality good enough for bathing. So big change in water quality.
Interesting. Okay, great. I think we probably have time for one more question, and I do understand that invasive species is not your focus area, but we did get a lot of upvotes on this. So I am curious if y'all have anyone who, any resource that you might want to point people to. Folks are really curious about treating for Phragmites. I know you guys are not invasive species specialists, so I'm aware of that. But I was curious, I do know that Sea Grant often has a lot on aquatic invasive species. Where would y'all point folks in terms of the first kind of line of defense or resources for aquatic invasive species remediation? I'm gonna guess it's specific to the state that you have, right? So maybe look at your state extension, state Department of Resource. Eagle probably has some resources on invasive species, but not in your wheelhouse, Eric.
Yeah, so we have our aquatic invasive species unit with Eagle that has a lot of resources, status and strategy documents and things like that. So I can put that link in the chat along with some of the other links if people are interested.
Adam, did you have anything to share?
Not resources. I think there was a question about the Phragmites removal. I don't know for sure, but I do know with other invasive species, the city does go with an herbicide, carefully placed, just to reduce the repeat removal that they would have to do if they did mechanical. So it's, different regulations, different sites, but I think that's, one of the things they use.
Yeah, so it's not easy to remove, or else people would know how to do it a lot easier, right? But the reason you're probably getting so many questions is just because it is so invasive. So I do understand that it is an issue with a lot of different areas. We can include some links there, and I know some folks are putting links in the chat, which is wonderful in terms of where to look for. I do know we're right up against the hour, so I want to thank our speakers so much for being here with us today. If you did have a question that you weren't able to get answered, I know there were lots of great questions in the chat that we didn't have time for. Feel free to reach out to them specifically. There's their websites. And thank you to everyone for joining us today, and to Eric, Scott, and Adam for lending their time and their talent here. We appreciate it. We will be joining again next month. We're going to be looking at citizen science as it relates to water and how that data is being used in various scenarios. So we hope you can join us next month again. Thanks, everyone.